Good morning. Glad you're here as we begin the Christmas season. I know in Florida, it is really hard to feel like Christmas sometimes, isn't it? And so hopefully tonight you decorate your palm tree and get all that going. Glad you're here, though. When we had first moved to Florida, when I was in high school, I lived in Wyoming for about 7 years, and I think my family, there were 5 of us in our family, we like doubled the population of Wyoming when we moved there. So when we left, it was a devastating blow to Wyoming. They didn't know what to do anymore. Nobody was there to pay taxes. I think half the town council was gone. So it was really a sad situation. I think they actually went back to territory status because we left. So we lived in Wyoming, which is a winter wonderland all year round, right? I mean, it really, you get those like 3 weeks of summer, and then the rest of the year is just snow and ice and sleet and that kind of thing. So we moved down to Florida. We moved to West Palm Beach, and we were living in Palm Beach for a few years. We lived in an area there called Green Acres. Yes, it really, yeah, and it was called it's the place to be. If there was no farming, nothing like that, no farm living. That was the life for me. But there were green acres that were open far and wide. And darling, I love you. But give me that countryside. We lived in Green Acres. And so we lived in Green Acres, Florida. And now it was a year like this year where Christmas Day fell on a Sunday morning. Okay, so Christmas Day was on a Sunday morning. And our church decided not to have Christmas Day services. We were having Christmas Eve services, not Christmas Day services at the time. And I don't know if my mom would admit this, but she wasn't very happy about that. She didn't want to not have Christmas Day services. She was like, we need to have Christmas Day services because, it's a Sunday morning. It just so happens that Christmas is that morning, so we should have Christmas Day services. And she was determined that we would still have a Christmas Day service, even if our church didn't. Now, my mom was even on staff at this church. My brother was on staff at this church, but we didn't have Christmas Day service, and my mom was going to make a statement. So Christmas Day came. That morning, we all got together, and we had breakfast, and my mom was like, I found us a Christmas Day service we're going to go to. So we went to a Christmas Day service. She drug us along. It was in a park there in Green Acres, and this church had this outdoor park. And so as you walked in to the park, they were handing out hot chocolate and wassail because it was only 750 degrees outside. You're like, great, this is perfect. I hope I don't spill it on my tank top. And so, I mean, you're already dripping sweat, and then they give you these warm beverages, and they have cookies. Very nice people, very nice church. But we're trying to drink the hot chocolate and the wassail because we were wassailing through Green Acres in South Florida. So we're walking through, and we're going to this gazebo, and there's this gazebo that they've rented out, and they've made it into a little stage. They're going to do this production on the stage. It wasn't much of a production. I mean, it was nice. But there were 4 people on stage. There was a baby who was rightfully in a manger. The baby was not thrilled about being in a manger, and so Mary had her hands full. But there was Mary, and then there was Joseph, and they were in their bathrobe situations, and they were kneeling down. And then there was this one singer who was up there, and she sang, "Mary, Did You Know?" So she sings "Mary, Did You Know" to a CD. Maybe there was a 5th guy somewhere because he hit the boombox. He hit play on the boombox. She sang "Mary, Did You Know?" And Mary and Joseph just kind of sat there and watched the baby. That's about all they did. That was their whole job. And so the song ends, and we're all kind of like, that was nice. And we're like, did she know? I mean, did she? I mean, it was really a good question. Like, we don't know if she knew. And so we were like, wow, this is really good. So Mary gets up, and she takes off with the baby, and they kind of walk off from the side of the gazebo, and they take off. And they're done. Well, Joseph doesn't necessarily do that. And Joseph just kind of stands up, and he kind of walks away for a second. And he just kind of walks to the back of the gazebo. And the pastor comes up and starts preaching. But Joseph doesn't really leave. Like, he's just kind of hanging out. He's listening to the pastor. I mean, he's pretty on board with what the pastor's saying. But he's just kind of watching all by himself. Then I guess Joseph may have had too much wassail, and he decided he was too warm. And he just took off the bathrobe. Joseph was only wearing very short swim shorts. There was no shirt on Joseph. There were no sandals. There was nothing else on Joseph. We saw a lot of Joseph that day. And Joseph just stood there the whole sermon, shirtless, just listening to the pastor preach. And he just kind of took the whole thing in, just watching the guy. Amen. Amen. And the pastor didn't seem fazed by it, which was good, but Joseph just hung out. I'm not going to lie, it ruined my Christmas seeing shirtless Joseph. It really did a number on me. That was the worst Christmas I can remember. Just watching shirtless Joseph. Yep. You bet. Then there was an altar call at the end. Everybody had to come forward and get saved. And Joseph decided that was the proper time for him to get saved as well. So he walked down to the front and he came around the front. Then he sat down there shirtless with everybody else. And he starts hugging all the people around him at the altar. Shirtless Joseph, just bringing people together. If you're wondering why we're not having a Christmas Day service, this is the reason. I don't want to give shirtless Joseph a chance to show up anywhere nearby. But we went to a Christmas Day service, and maybe you're like my mom, where like you can't imagine not having that. And maybe you're like my mom, and you can't imagine not having a nativity. Like the nativity scene, the scene of Mary and Joseph and the baby, like that just speaks Christmas to you. And it does for a lot of us, right? Like we see the nativity and we instantly think Christmas. Right? Even yesterday, we were at the Winterfest over in Newport Richey. We were at the Verizon Center again. And there was this couple sitting across from us, and they were really good at balloon animals. Tornadic balloon animals, I think they were called. Tornadic, which I thought was really something. I kept calling it tornadic, which just sounded more proper. But their balloon animals were amazing. And they were building this sleigh with Santa in it out of their balloon creatures. And the sleigh was really cool, but at first I thought it was a manger because I grew up in church too long. And I was like, is that a manger they're building? And then I saw Santa and I was like, I don't remember those two being in the same place at the same time. But I grew up with the nativity scene, and maybe that's the way you grew up. Maybe you've seen it in all the figurines and all the fancy ways that you can put a nativity together. They're really beautiful things, and it's a great picture for us, right? Like it's a great picture of how this whole scene, this whole web was woven by God, and he puts all these people together in the same place at the same time. We like that idea, and that's the natural view. I mean, that's all the natural things. Those are the natural pieces of how this came together, how this whole scene came to be there. Those are all the natural pieces. We have the animals, we have the people, we have all these things happening that we can see tangibly, and now we see the natural side of it. But what about the supernatural side of Christmas? What about the side that's bigger than the natural side? What about the side that's way more than what we can even sometimes put into words of what happens at Christmas when Jesus really comes to earth? I want to look at that, and this is going to be maybe a weird series because for Christmas, I don't really want to look at the nativity scene as much as I want to look at what was going on behind the scenes as God made this happen, as Jesus comes to earth in the broader, the bigger picture of what it took and who Jesus really is when he comes to earth. And I want to look at the story from John's point of view. See, we have the Gospels, and we have 4 Gospels, right? There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke, and there's John. In John's Gospel, he doesn't really do the nativity scene. He doesn't set it up that way. He doesn't give us the shepherds and the wise men. He doesn't give us Mary and Joseph sitting around a manger. He kind of just blows through all that stuff. But he gives us this grander picture of what happens. See, when John writes his gospel, he's writing later than everybody else. He writes at a different time. So we have Matthew. Matthew wrote probably the first gospel, more than likely. And Matthew would have written that first gospel, and then Mark would have taken the next gospel, and he would have written second, and then third would have been Luke. And they all kind of wrote really around the same time. It was very similar times that they had. They wrote really close together. And they all kind of wrote the same accounts, really good stuff. But Matthew, when he wrote, he was writing to a very small group of people, a very defined group of people. And when Mark wrote, he was writing to a very, very small segment and group of people, maybe even just one person. When Luke wrote, Luke was only writing possibly to just one person, for one person to read his whole gospel. But when John writes, he's waited. And he's years and years later. He's in about 90 AD, almost 60 years after Jesus has left the earth. He's had time to see what has happened with the other gospels that have been written. And now he knows that whatever he writes will be read by everybody. It's going to be in circulation. There's going to be a lot of people reading what I write. He knows there's gravity to what he's writing. He knows how important it is. He knows that it's going to be a bestseller. What he knows of his writing is it's going to be very important. And so he takes a whole different twist the way he writes his gospel because he knows this is really important and there's already been good things said, but I want to say something even deeper. And so he starts off his gospel with this thing, this prologue, okay? So there's like almost, when you're reading a book and you have the preface, he kind of begins with this preface. And he starts with this preface. It's the first 18 verses of his book. And the first 18 verses are kind of this preface. Now, it's actually believed that maybe he went back and wrote these 18 verses later. Because maybe he started with the action, he started with the actual story, which begins in verse 19, and maybe that was all good, but he felt like, I need to go back and I need to say something to set this story up. So he went back and maybe wrote these first 18 verses later. Maybe he came back and did that. And these first 18 verses are so brilliantly written that for about the first 300 years of the church, especially theologians they almost just wrestled with these. It became a hymn in the church. They would sing these verses because it became so important for them to understand what it meant. And for 300 years, theologians literally they had such a hard time with these words because they were so deep and so powerful that they were trying to figure out what they meant. So there were 300 years where people trying to figure that out. So I'm going to try to sum it up in about 30 minutes here. So it should go really well. But they look at this huge passage. Now we're just going to spend a few minutes in the first 5 verses is what we're going to spend over the next few weeks. Is really those first 5 verses are so critical. And maybe it's a little ambitious to only take a small section of the Bible and expect to be able to make sermons out of that. But that's what we're going to try to do with this, is try to just take about the first 5 verses and really look at that. And I want to just read the first 5 verses, and then we'll come back to some other stuff. So it says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it or overcome it. So he has this huge 5 verses. A little while back, we were at Disney, and my kids, we went to go see the Finding Nemo musical. Has anybody seen this thing? They have this musical of Finding Nemo. It's fantastic. It really is. And we went to go see it. My daughter loves Nemo. She loves anything that's underwater, like anything underwater. She loves it. So we went to go see Finding Nemo, and we went to go see the musical. Now, the musical is really, it's people singing with fish puppets up over their shoulders. They have puppets, which I thought was kind of lame because I was like, I guess Disney thought it would be too difficult to teach fish to sing by themselves. I was like, where's the magic, Disney? Make the fish sing. Pull it together, y'all. But anyways, they felt that it was more appropriate for people to sing, and they would just carry around fish. So there's these people singing, and they carry around the fish, and they do the whole play, this whole musical of Finding Nemo. And it's really exciting. It's really well done, and there's lots of lights and lots of fog, which really concerned my daughter at first, because she was like, is that smoke, Dad? Can we breathe that smoke? And I was like, yes, we can. Yes, we can. I thought we weren't supposed to breathe smoke. Well, this one's okay. Just trust me on this. So she was watching the musical, and she was so intense. I've never seen my daughter just so excited about something, and she just could not take it all in. It was awesome. And she watched these performers as they went around in these jumpsuits, and they would carry these puppets and they would sing. And you could tell she loved the whole thing. So as soon as we got home, we came home, and as soon as we got home, she had to put on the play herself. So she was like, Daddy, we're going to put on the play. And I was like, that's awesome. She's like, what? I was like, what play? And she was like, the Nemo play. I was like, oh yeah, let's do the Nemo play. That's great. And she's like, first we have to put on pajamas because the people were wearing pajamas while they carried around the puppets. I was like, yeah. So we had to put on our pajamas. And then we had to get our puppets. And she laid out all of her Nemo toys that she has. Now, they're all various sizes. And some of them have been in a bathtub. And some of them are stuffed animals, whatever. But she gave us all our assigned parts. And we all had our little toys. And then she took all of her stuffed animals that were not Nemo related. And she set them up in our living room so they could be the audience. So we were performing for Clifford and Daniel Tiger, and I think Daniel Tiger, he's a tough critic, but he seemed okay with it. So we're watching, all those are watching us, and we have all our props, and we're ready to go for the play. And we stand there for a second for the play, and we're about to start, and none of us know exactly how to start it. And so I looked at Jane, I said, well, how did it start? And she goes, I don't remember. And as she stood there for just a second, all of us kind of looked at each other, all 4 of us just kind of stood there looking at each other. And out of nowhere, my son, he goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, Finding Nemo will begin in just a few minutes." Well done. Stalling for time, that guy. And then I was like, "So what happened after that, Oliver?" He was like, "I don't remember." He just remembered the announcer beforehand. That's all he got out of the whole play. And so he got designated the announcer for the rest of the time, where he didn't do anything else, but he just said the first things that happened. And it's kind of funny because the way Oliver apparently remembers the whole play, he doesn't remember anything else that happens, but he remembers the very first line before the play even began. And that's the first verse of this. Is kind of like before the play even begins, before things really even go anywhere, there's this first line that we kind of have to tune into. And it's a really, really brilliant line. It could be a huge first line that he starts with, right? Like John could have started with a huge first line. Like if you've, in literature where you have things like, "Call me Ishmael." Does anybody know what book that's from? From Moby Dick? You have that first line, or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We should all get better at that one, right? Or the whole, "It's the best of times, it's the worst of times, it's the age of belief, it was all that stuff." The longest run-on sentence of all time that Charles Dickens wrote at the beginning of The Tale of Two Cities. And it could have been this huge epic line, but instead of this big, long, overzealous line, John kind of shows us that he would have been awesome at Twitter, because he takes all this huge theology and he condenses it down to just a few words. And he makes this small little statement that just rings of so much depth. He says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is a huge statement. We'll talk about the Word. We'll talk about what the Word means more next week. But the Word itself, that means Jesus, that he's this incarnation of God, right? So the Word is speaking of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. He was also with God. Now, there's kind of some different things happening here. First of all, John was considered a complete heretic for this verse, just so you know. He wasn't necessarily well liked by a lot of theologians, because any Jewish reader or writer would have known immediately what that first line represented. In the beginning. Where else do we see that? In Genesis chapter 1. We see it at the very beginning of all of the Bible. The very first line that the Bible opens up with is "in the beginning." That's a huge, huge line. And people were very upset at the time with John for using this line, "in the beginning." In the beginning. So he starts there, in the beginning, and then he brings Jesus into the picture in such a brilliant way. Now, there's two words. There's a lot of dualism in John's writing. If you ever studied Greek mythology, anybody study this stuff? There was a lot of dualism in the language. You would compare two things, and by comparing them, you would show each one's strength, but you would compare them to one another. So there's things like light and darkness, for instance. Light and dark would be great dualism, or heaven and earth. He talks a lot about heaven and earth in this book because it's great dualism. And there's also times where he would use dualism of things like is and becoming. They're not necessarily the same thing, right? Is something that has been, and becoming is something that is changing. It's becoming something, right? And he uses that dualism throughout the book, but he doesn't use it here. It's this word gnomai, which is becoming, but this emi, which is this word that means is. And he's saying the Word just is. The Word was with God, just was. Didn't just become with God, it was, always would be. Was with God, which is in the word was, always will be God. Didn't just become that, didn't just change into that, didn't just morph into that, has always been. Now, it's interesting too, because he says with God, which means with is to separate him as a separate entity from God. Right? It's something different. We don't say I don't usually say hey, I'm going to go to the mall with myself. I don't say with unless it's with something else, a separate entity, right? So I have a separate entity was with God, but at the same time was God. Was also God. This is a huge statement. And he's kind of giving us like this glimpse into Jesus's like origin story. Does anybody know like what an origin story is? My son got really into Big Hero 6. Has anybody seen Big Hero 6? It's a classic tale of a boy and his robot. And we were at Disney and we saw Baymax, that's the robot's name there, the big Michelin man looking guy. And they kept having to tell my son Oliver not to lean on him because apparently Baymax can just fall right over. But Oliver kept leaning on him because he just wanted to be near him so badly that they had to put a worker behind Baymax to hold Baymax up while my son was pushing on him from the front. And so they had to hold Baymax up. But this is a picture of Oliver with Baymax. Baymax is actually a Marvel comic. If you don't know this, the story of Big Hero 6 is actually a Marvel comic. It was kind of a lesser known one that Disney found when they bought the rights to all the Marvel shows. And they kind of took this idea of like, oh, we could make this into a kid's movie. And so they made this movie, Big Hero 6. And in this, there's this one character who's this laid-back guy who's kind of, he's really bright, but he's also like really funny. And anyways, his name's Freddy. And Freddy is who I fear that my son will become. I'm pretty confident this will be Oliver in just a few short years. But Freddy says this line when they're in the middle of becoming superheroes in Big Hero 6. And he says, "This is our origin story." And my son looked at me and he was like, "What's an origin story?" And I was like, I don't know. I had to Wikipedia it. And the origin story, if you know superheroes at all, there's this like thing, there's this backstory of who they were. And it tells us, it informs us of what they've become. So for instance, like if you've seen Batman, right? He's a wealthy guy, his parents are killed in the streets, and now he becomes a superhero to fight crime, using his wealth, using his resources to stop the crime in his city, right? Like it's pretty simple how that works. And then he brought in Morgan Freeman to help with that. Because who else would you want but Morgan Freeman? Goodness. Yeah. And I mean, like if you just saw Doctor Strange was a big one just recently. We saw that a little while back. It was not my favorite, but we did watch it. And you know, he's this doctor, and then he gets in a car accident, and his hands get messed up, and he can't be a surgeon anymore, so he has to go visit a bald woman who tells him how to meditate, and then he becomes this new superhero. We have to learn the origin story to understand them. And it's like John's kind of giving us this origin story, but see, Jesus' origin story goes all the way back to the beginning. Now, I don't know your origin story. I don't really know how yours worked. I know mine wasn't perfect. Like if you have an origin story, some of us, it could be broken families. Mine was a family that wasn't well put together. Mine was a family that thought on the outside everything looked perfect, and on the inside things crumbled so fast. Maybe you come from an origin story where you come from that story of the mother who was abusive to you. Maybe your origin story begins with an alcoholic father. Maybe your origin story is that you came from nothing. Maybe your origin story is that you came from too much. We all have origin stories. We all have places we've come from. And some of ours are really maybe pretty boring, and some of ours are so ugly, we don't want anybody to ever understand the depths of them. The thing about Jesus is that he is there at the beginning. He sees the world in its perfection. He's seen the world before sin and shame enter in. He understands what it's like to breathe life into people. We see that in Genesis 1, verse 26, where it says that God says, "Let us make mankind in our image. He's saying us, talking to Jesus. Jesus was there. He remembers the perfection of the world. He remembers before sin and shame. He remembers what it's like to breathe life into people. And the important thing is not that Jesus was there then. The important thing is that Jesus is here now. That's the story of Christmas. Is that the same Jesus who saw perfection is coming back into the mess to restore it. The same Jesus who understood the world before sin and shame is coming here to redeem that same world from sin and from shame. That Jesus who breathed life into man for the first time is the same Jesus who's here to breathe life into each and every one of us, eternal life. That same Jesus. And I don't say that to sound like it's some kind of feel-good speech. That's not the goal here. Is to say like, oh, it's a new beginning and that's great. There's truth to that. I just say it because I have sat with so many people over the last few months who are sitting there at the end of a marriage where they don't know where to go next. I've sat with people who are at the end of a job where they just don't know where to go next. I've sat with people who are at the end of relationships, who are at the end of families, who are at the end of loss, at the end of life with people, and they don't know where to go next. And the thing is, Jesus is not just there in the beginning, but there is a new beginning. There's a new beginning that he offers us. That's why Christmas is so important, because Christmas changes everything. It changes everything. He was there in the beginning, but he offers a new beginning right now. This isn't just Jesus who comes in a manger. This is Jesus who is God. Just because he changed his state of being does not mean he changed his status. He is still God. He still offers the same love, the same redemption, the same power as God. And he does it right now in our midst because there's a new beginning, because he came to this earth. Don't let that pass you by this season. Don't let that just wash past you to the point where you forget it or you miss it. Understand that because Jesus came, we all have new beginnings that we're given. The same God that was there in the beginning is offering us a new beginning right now. The story's being rewritten right in our midst. If you've never really experienced that, if you don't really understand that, we'd love to pray with you about that. Janessa's down here. We'd love to pray with you about that. Joyce is in the back over there, and Glenda, they'd be happy to pray with you too, I'm sure. But grab somebody, pray with them. If you've never experienced that before, as we sing together, as we kind of respond to that, it's not just a one-time thing. It's not something really simple, but if you've never experienced that, just pray with somebody. Ask somebody to pray about your life, where you're at. Maybe the end of the road that you're at, where you're looking for a new beginning. Maybe the spot where you're kind of stuck right now. Ask somebody to pray with you about that. If you don't fully understand it, again, during this series, we're going to be talking about that. I invite you to come back just because we're going to be talking about this new life, because we do believe that Christmas changes everything. Not just 2,000 years ago, but still in our midst today. Let's stand together and we're going to pray. God, I thank you. I thank you for being a God who didn't just exist once upon a time, that you weren't just a long time ago a God, but that you're a God who sent your Son. That you're a God who you didn't change your status, but you did change your state of being, and you came to this earth to offer each and every one of us a new beginning. And God, I thank you for doing that. God, I pray for us over this season, over Christmas, over this time that we spend together and with our families and with our friends and all the festivities that happen, God, remind us that it's not just a happy season, not just a joyful season, but God, that this is a season that we remember every year because this is when the world changed, because your Son came to this earth, and not just the world as a globe and as a whole, but every single one of us have the chance to change, to start again, to have a new beginning. Remind us of that. God, when it feels like we're at the end of our rope, at the end of a road, God, remind us that you offer us a brand new, clean slate. That the God who was there in the beginning is still here with us today. So God, remind us of that as we walk into this season. Allow us not to get comfortable with the season. Allow us to still be challenged by this season. Still be challenged by your word, challenged by your gift to us. Praise things in your name.